Hey, I just want to say before this video really starts that this is my first video and my first time ever editing, so please be gentle. Please like, subscribe, and share because it actually helps me out a lot and it motivates me to make more stuff like this. Now, with that being said, I'm Bryson Morris. I am a political science student, political activist, community organizer, and a leftist. This video essay is meant to challenge many of the preconceived notions that you may or may not have had about the US government and modern history. Because whether we like it or not, American presidents are war criminals. Now, I think it's important before I lay out how each president is allegedly implicated in or directly responsible for war crimes against humanity. I think it's important to lay out exactly what a war crime is. So for our purposes, the definition of a war crime is anything that constitutes a grave breach of the 1949 Geneva Convention or any subsequent convention, because there was a lot of them. Now, there are many classifications for breaches, but in the sake of time and hopefully entertainment, it can basically boil down to willful killing of civilians, torture or inhumane treatment, causing great suffering, unlawful continued destruction of property, unlawful deportation or confinement, taking hostages, targeting civilian infrastructure, targeting humanitarian aid, launching attacks at military targets that are obviously excessive and will cause overwhelming damage to the population, and more, according to the International Committee of the Red Cross. Whew, that was a lot. Now, to all my leftists out there, this video is not meant to be a complete and comprehensive list of every war crime ever committed by every modern U.S. president, because that would take multiple hours to talk about. There's a lot of war crimes. This video, rather, is to shed light on incidents that the average American may not know about, and if they do know about it, they may not want to think about it. And hopefully give a few examples on why each president, maybe even your favorite, is a war criminal. Now, when speaking about Donald Trump and Joe Biden, I think it's important to point out that it is codified in international and U.S. law that complicity in genocide is classified as a crime against humanity. Not only that, but the law states that any government which agrees to the Geneva Convention rules has a duty to stop genocide when it becomes aware that it has happened or happening and has the potential to happen. I will dive deeper into this in my section on Joe Biden, but for now, let's talk about our glorious king, Donald J. Trump. So I'm just going to jump straight into it and get it out of the way up front and say that Donald Trump is complicit in the genocide in Gaza. Jewish Voice for Peace, the United Nations, Amnesty International, Genocide Watch, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, International Association of Genocide Scholars. Do I need to go on, or do you get the point? All of these credible organizations claim that a genocide has been taking place in Gaza since October 7th. And at this point, it's not even really a thing that people who are educated on the topic debate anymore. It's just known. So I don't think it has to be explicitly pointed out, but I'll do it anyways. Trump and his administration have bypassed Congress multiple times, even though Congress likely would have done it for him, to send massive weapons and money packages to Israel worth many, many billions of dollars while they committed genocide in Gaza, which is a crime against the Geneva Convention. So the second Trump war crime that we're going to be talking about is one that you may have heard of, and it is the girls' school in Iran. Now, earlier this year, the USA and Israel launched a full-scale war against Iran. The merits of that war don't really need to be debated, as that's a topic for another time, but I will say that it makes these crimes against humanity even worse if you understand that this is almost a completely pointless war of choice based on false pretenses. Now back to the girls' school. I don't think that you need a guy to explain to you why bombing a girls' school is bad, but Amnesty International claims the fact that the school building was directly targeted and was previously part of the IRGC compound raises concerns that the U.S. forces may have relied on outdated intelligence and failed in their obligation to do everything feasible to verify that the intended target was a military objective. So they found it was the United States who bombed the school, and they found that it was directly targeted. Case closed. Deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. 156 people were killed in that one attack. 119 children. Rest in peace.
Tell that to the folks in Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Minnesota!
After October 7th, 2023, Israel ramped up its mass slaughter campaign on the Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza, and there is genocidal concerns in the West Bank and certainly apartheid and ethnic cleansing. Joe Biden was the president then, and he did not exit until January 20th, 2025. 471 days as president, while our greatest ally commits genocide. Amnesty International called Gaza the most documented genocide in history. On November 16, 2023, the United States called on international communities to prevent genocide in Gaza. This is realistically the last moment that even the strongest Joe Biden lovers could say he didn't know the situation on the ground, even in the most charitable interpretation. In January 2024, Jewish Voice for Peace officially called it a genocide. In November 2024, the UN called it a genocide. In December, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Genocide Watch all officially declared it a genocide. Despite this, Biden provided at least $17.9 billion of military aid to Israel in that first year of the genocide. Only once did he withhold aid, and even then, he sent parts of that same aid package months later because he was being bullied by Benjamin Netanyahu. From this, we can conclude that anyone with a rational, working brain, which we cannot confirm that Joe Biden had, could have seen by late 2023 and certainly 2024 that something was incredibly wrong in Israel, and we should have at the very least ceased our funding to them. But in reality, according to the Geneva Convention's rules of stopping genocide when there is a threat of it, Biden should have put sanctions or pressure on Israel in November 2023 and ceased all aid of all kinds to the country.
Gotta have them ribs. And pussy too.
So, in 2015, under President Barack Obama, the U.S. military bombed the Doctors Without Borders hospital and medical facility in Kunduz, Afghanistan. 42 people were killed. Now, I know this video has some jokes in it to keep your attention and to keep you entertained, but I don't want to take the sting out of how real these events are. So, trigger warning, I'm about to read a graphic excerpt from Doctors Without Borders to illustrate this event. Starting at 2:08 a.m. on Saturday the 3rd, October, a United States AC-130 gunship fired 211 shells on the main hospital building where patients were sleeping in their bed or being operated on in operating theater. At least 42 people were killed, including 24 patients, 14 staff, and 4 caretakers. 37 people were injured. Our patients burned in their beds. Our medical staff were decapitated or lost limbs. Others were shot from the air while they fled the burning building. The attack from the air lasted for around an hour. The main hospital building came under precise and repeated airstrikes, while the surrounding buildings were left mostly untouched. Throughout the airstrikes, our teams desperately called military authorities to stop the attack. And I just want to say, I know that was really heavy, and it sucks to hear, but I do think it's important to illustrate events like these, because while we sit at home on our iPhones or you watch this video on your computer or your iPad, there are things like this happening all across the world at the hands of our government, and we don't even think about it. And so I think it's just important for you every once in a while to hear something like that. Now back to the scheduled programming. Now, the U.S. military later claimed responsibility for the attack, calling it an accident. An accident. To me, an accident is walking to the sink with your bowl of cereal and spilling it on the ground on accident. Or a kid tripping and hitting their friend, causing them to fall as well. That's an accident. This, though, was no accident. This was murder of civilians and a direct, targeted attack on civilian infrastructure. To make it even worse, the Geneva Convention says that civilian hospitals are to be the object of attack under, quote, no circumstances. So this was a war crime, and it doesn't matter how you shake it. Oh yeah, by the way, Obama wanted a Nobel Peace Prize.
I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully.
We must stop the terror.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Now, Georgie boy here makes my job kind of easy, if I'm being honest with you. There's quite a few war crimes to talk about here, so I'll focus on one or two for the sake of brevity. So first, let's remember back to the list of grave breaches in the Geneva Convention that I gave at the beginning of the video. Two of the things explicitly listed were torture and inhumane treatment, as well as unlawful containment. Those are the two breaches I'll touch on for George. In his memoir, Bush is asked about authorizing the use of torture on a certain detainee, to which he replied, quote, "Damn right." Well, there it is, I guess. All right, I'm just kidding. But we're not done with George yet. So there are two facets to this story, the one in the public eye and the reality on the ground. So in 2005, Bush signed the Detainee Treatment Act, which on its face does kind of look and read like the no torture bill, which I think is pretty funny that we even have to have one of those, but I digress. Now, although I will say I read the bill, and it is pretty ambiguous and says torture is not allowed, unless we say so. And it defined torture under an old school pamphlet, which I had to read, and which didn't even define torture. It just sent me to another pamphlet that I couldn't find. So in 2007, the president said, quote, "The U.S. does not torture people." I guess he forgot about that when he released his memoir only 3 years later. Now, however, behind the scenes, in the aftermath of 9/11, the Bush administration was arguing that the Geneva Convention grounds for torture were unclear and likely did not apply to wartime detainees. Through this, they developed what they called advanced interrogation techniques to be used by the CIA and U.S. military in the global war on terror. George even publicly acknowledged these advanced techniques in 2006 at Guantanamo Bay, of all places. All right, take a second, get a breath, stand up, get a snack, whatever you got to do, all right? You back? Let's get back into it. So I realize I've spent about as much time on Bush already as I did on the other presidents, and I haven't even got to the second war crime yet. But that's because this shit really is that deep. So to save both of our time, I will kind of rush through the second section of this. However, I just want to note that none of this is unimportant. The torture and treatment of detainees in the war on terror is an entire video on its own, and I'd be down to make that video in the future if you'd like. So black site is the term used to describe a single location in a network of secret prisons operated by the Central Intelligence Agency, otherwise known as the CIA. With exceptions, particularly in Africa, these prisons are typically located in Eastern Europe in countries that were either members of the former Soviet Union or under its sphere of influence. Hastily conceived in the weeks immediately following 9/11, the Black Site Network was designed to house unlawful enemy combatants. The black sites are largely where a lot of the torture happened. And most of the time, these prisoners were transferred by unmarked aircrafts as to conceal the operation. These sites were supposed to be secretive and unknown as to hide the atrocities there. After being tortured at the site, detainees were most often sent to Guantanamo Bay Prison for longer and undefined sentences. This is what I would define as the textbook definition of what the Geneva Convention called unlawful containment or detention. Don't believe me? America began distributing flyers in Pakistan and Afghanistan offering lots of money in return for, quote, suspicious people. This resulted in mass waves of kidnappings and arrests of innocent peoples who were then turned over to the U.S. government to be unlawfully imprisoned. 86% of the detainees in Guantanamo Bay were detained this way specifically, and only 8% were thought to have actually been Al-Qaeda fighters. Now, only 8 detainees were ever convicted of a crime from Guantanamo Bay, and only 4 of those convictions were actually held because the other 4 were overturned. One young man, an 18-year-old from Yemen, was doing research in Afghanistan shortly before he would start university. He had a black bag put over his head and he was kidnapped by Afghan warlords and accused of being an Al-Qaeda leader. He was handed over to the CIA, who eventually shipped him to Gitmo or Guantanamo Bay. There, he was beaten, physically, mentally, and psychologically tortured, had his bones broken, and was deprived of the basic decency that most people would treat a stray dog with. He was eventually released in 2016 after almost 2 decades of horror. He was never convicted of anything. But it's important to understand that he is not alone. There have been 780 people detained in Guantanamo Bay since 2002. 9 of them died there, and there are believed to still be 15 held there now. Lastly, I want to give you the words of Major General Antonio Tagaba, who served under Bush at the Abu Ghraib prison, one of the worst prisons there. And if I were to do a video on this in a deeper dive, Abu Ghraib is probably one of the most infamous places. He said, "There is no longer any doubt as to whether the current administration has committed war crimes. The only question that remains to be answered is whether those who ordered the use of torture will be held to account." And I got a spoiler for Major General Antonio Tagaba. Fuck no, they won't be held to account. Well, based off the picture I just showed you and, some files that we're not going to go deep into today, it's pretty evident that Bill was getting up to some other shit other than war crimes in the 90s. But nevertheless, that's what this video is about. So I'll keep my entry on Bill here pretty short because he is one of the ones that I could find the least amount of information on. And I don't want to do a deep dive on the Bosnian War, Yugoslavian civil wars, and the Bosnian Muslims being targeted with acts of genocide. The long story short is, there was a war between Serbs, Bosnians, and Croats on ethnic grounds. It was a quasi-war for independence from one another, and it was categorized as ethnic cleansing, mostly orchestrated by the Serbs. There was a systemic mass rape campaign and mass civilian killings. This was happening for 3 entire years before Bill Clinton or the international community stepped in a meaningful capacity, which could be perceived as negligence to ethnic cleansing and/or genocide. In the bombing campaign that commenced at the order of Bill Clinton and NATO, 152 civilians were killed. Then, in 1999, Yugoslavia was at war with Kosovo. A UN and NATO, quote, peacekeeping operation took place, and once again, with Bill's involvement and go-ahead, at least 500 civilians were killed and 6,000 more were injured. Now, this second campaign was given much more scrutiny because of the higher civilian death count, more civilian infrastructure destroyed, and about 60% of the civilians killed were on the actual side that NATO was supposedly defending. So good on you there, NATO. But in short, this is a collection of civilian death as a result of possible targeting, but certainly negligence, possible complicity in ethnic cleansing, and destruction of civilian infrastructure. All war crimes. So I'm also going to kind of keep the section on George H.W. Bush short because personally I kind of find it boring, and I also find George H.W. Bush boring. Now, however, war crimes were committed multiple times, and it's very easy to see Bush as an extension of the Reagan administration. Therefore, you can kind of toss a lot of the feelings about the next subject of this video, Reagan, onto Bush as well. So, in 1989, the Bush administration invaded Panama because their leader Noriega declared a state of war against the USA. There was also a political opponent that the Bush administration sided with who lost an election to Noriega and then claimed the results were fraudulent and that the election was stolen from him. This gave Bush the go-ahead to invade, with the intent of removing Noriega and putting, effectively, a U.S. puppet in charge. Now, I don't really care to validate or put my 2 cents on any of these claims, as it's not really what matters in the context of this video. What matters is there was a humanitarian crisis in Panama before and after the invasion, and the removal of a particular leader without changing or fixing the system or the situation in any way did not help that situation. There was intense fighting when the U.S. first landed. 300 civilians were killed in the fighting. Great destruction of civilian homes were clearly observable, quote, from Human Rights Watch. 5,000 Panamanians were arrested by the USA, including civilians. U.S. military kept a police presence in Panama even after the invasion was over. No explanation for the arrests of non-combatants were given, and they did not allow international organizations to access them. It was called Operation Just Cause. But personally, I think Operation Just Cause is a much more fitting name. Now, in 1990, the Iraqi military invaded Kuwait over oil, land, and debt disputes. So in early 1991, the Bush administration had the USA join the war in defense of Kuwait. The war itself is not entirely the focus here. However, one specific piece of the war is. So there was a highway that connected Iraq and Kuwait that Iraqi militants would use to transport soldiers and vehicles through. During the Iraqi retreat, an American-led coalition of offensive aircrafts bombed the road, including retreating soldiers. The bombing of this road can be justified in some ways due to its use for transportation of military personnel during times of war. However, bombing and killing approximately 1,000 soldiers and more than 1,000 vehicles in retreat cannot really be justified. Now, certain jurisdictions, certain countries, and different versions of international law will interpret this in other ways, but to me, this just kind of sounds like shooting a soldier in the back when he's walking away from you if you were on the ground. Now, this was essentially the attack that showed America was willing to inflict massive and overwhelming force, which resulted in the Iraqi surrender. So moving on now to conservative Jesus, otherwise known as Ronald Reagan. He has a few, and I cut a few out because they were maybe a little less damning, but I give you a few here, and we're going to start with Libya in 1986. So tensions were rising between Libya and the Western powers, and in response to a killing of 56 Libyan sailors in a military operation, the dictator of Libya, Muammar al-Gaddafi, who you may have heard of, sponsored a terrorist bombing in a club in Germany which killed 2 U.S. soldiers. This prompted Reagan to bomb Libya in an attempt to reportedly kill al-Gaddafi and retaliate against the terror attack. Now, although this data is not widely known, it's reported that this attack killed 63 people. One of the people killed in the attack was the leader Gaddafi's son, and another was his adopted daughter, who at the time was an infant. Now, I don't want to have to be that guy, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and just, take a stand and say, maybe killing babies is bad? Thoughts? So now that we got the lighthearted stuff out of the way, let's move on to the invasion of Grenada. So Grenada, as you probably didn't know, had a Marxist leader in the 80s named Bishop, and he was allied with the Soviet Union, and it's important to remember that this was during the end of the Cold War. So Bishop was building an airport on his island. I know, scary, right? It was allegedly for military purposes, so the US was scared it could be used for Soviet weapons or surveillance. I guess no one who is left-wing is allowed to have an airport in the same hemisphere as Reagan. Anyways, Bishop was subject to a military coup, lined up against a wall, and shot. Reagan invaded after that, citing fears about 600 U.S. college students on the island being taken hostage or something similar to the Iran hostage crisis. During this invasion, 24 civilians were killed. 18 of them were inside of a mental hospital, which is civilian infrastructure, by the way, and it was, quote, mistakenly bombed by the Americans. The UN General Assembly ruled this invasion as an abomination of international law. So even if you want to actually count that mental hospital as not a war crime, the invasion was against international law entirely, so technically anyone killed in this invasion was against the law. And this last one, if you are a little bit older or you are a little bit more history-oriented, you might know. It's called Iran-Contra. So first, you have to understand that Reagan had dedicated most of his presidency to fighting communism worldwide. It's like what he did. He was particularly and heavily involved in Nicaragua, where the U.S. was backing the Contras against the Cuban-backed Sandinistas. Reagan said the Contras were, quote, the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers. Now take that in. And then I'd like to point out that the Contras allegedly committed multiple human rights violations and at least 1,300 terrorist attacks. But who am I to judge? So Reagan funded them heavily as they engaged in guerrilla warfare, but a sequence of laws passed by the Democrats in Congress basically made supporting the Contras legally impossible. But who cares about the law, right? Like, Reagan's the president, and if you ask his buddy Nixon, the president's above the law.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. by definition.
Exactly.
So where does Iran come into the picture, right? So Iran was at war with Iraq, and Iran was our stated enemy, as in the late 70s, Iran's insurgent government had taken many Americans hostage and had still not released a lot of them by Reagan's time. Iran needed missiles for their war. America needed hostages. I smell a deal. So Reagan made that deal, secretly, and was then exposed by Middle Eastern media, to which he lied to the American public. After everyone knew he was lying, he backtracked on his lie and lied a little more. But that's not all. It also came out that a high-ranking official was using the funds from the deal with Iran to back the terrorist Contras in Nicaragua, supposedly from orders he had received from higher up. He allegedly claimed that his boss had Reagan's blessing to do so. Now, you can do research on your own if you think Reagan was guilty or not. However, it's pretty relevant, I think, to state that when Bush, Reagan's vice president at the time, was eventually elected as U.S. president, he pardoned most of the individuals involved in this crime. Jimmy Carter. Just a simple peanut farmer from Georgia, human rights advocate, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and an early adopter of green energy, right? Right? He couldn't have committed a war crime. Oh, but he could. Now, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the U.S. officially pulled out of all of Southeast Asia in 1975. Just then, Indonesia invaded East Timor with the backing of the United States. The U.S.'s main priority here, after pulling out, was to support their allied right-wing governments as to continue stamping out possible communism without actually military intervention. Now, Indonesia was one such country. They invaded, and an estimated 75% of the weapons they used were from the USA. Now, when Carter got into office, he more than doubled the military and financial aid into Indonesia. The Carter administration then lied to Congress about it to justify their support, claiming that the situation in Indonesia was calm and that most of the people dying there were from before the invasion, which sounds like a pretty stupid and provable lie to me, but whatever, I'm not Congress. So some further context. In 4 years, the Indonesian occupation of East Timor resulted in 175,000 deaths, 25% of East Timor's entire population in 1975. The occupation purposefully targeted civilians, involved mass killings, quote, resettlement camps, and the destruction of entire villages. The Indonesian forces also used destruction of crops and mass starvation as a weapon of war. Oxford, Yale, and the Holocaust Museum all classified this sequence of events as a genocide. These were the guys that Carter doubled weapon sales to. Now, in 2007, Carter was asked about it at the time, and he said, quote, "I was not as thoroughly briefed about what was going on in East Timor as I should have been." Holy shit. All right, folks, that's all I have for you for now. If you stuck around to the end, thank you so very much. This is my first ever YouTube video, first video essay, first time editing, first everything. So let me know what you liked about it, what you didn't like, and please show some support because I really enjoyed making this video and I'd love to make more in the future. If you have any ideas or comments on videos you'd like me to do, topics you'd like me to cover in the future, please just let me know. So thank you. Bye.